Welcome back once again to The Art of Conversation, a radio show dedicated to a college course dedicated to the art of conversation. This program is brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University, Bloomsburg. I am your host, Eric C. Miller, Professor of Communication Studies. Each semester, I teach a class available in your course catalog as Honors 211, The Art of Conversation, that focuses on the ancient art of dialectic, that is, the collaborative process by which knowledgeable peers pursue the truth through focused question and answer. After a few weeks of wading through the theory on these matters, our students spend about 10 weeks in practice, holding twice weekly 75-minute deep dives into topics and questions of their own choosing. Our theme this semester is the state of the earth and the good life upon it, granting students considerable leeway in their choice of content. Every week, twice a week, we're talking about how to live better lives on this planet. My guests today are Jocelyn and Sophie, two student moderators who this week asked our class to think a little bit about censorship and free speech on social media. Jocelyn, Sophie, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So before we get going today, as is customary on this show, we asked to learn a little bit about our guests. Tell us a little bit about yourselves, where you're from, what you're studying, what you want to do with your lives.
My name is Jocelyn. I'm a communication studies major here at Bloomsburg, and I have an emergent media minor as well. I'm a senior this semester, graduating in December. I hope to go off to grad school eventually. I'm not sure if I'm going to leap right into that or if I'm going to take some time to explore the world, explore the job force, stuff like that. But yeah, I'm hoping to go into some sort of administrative level in a company, maybe on a college campus, maybe for a nonprofit, that sort of thing.
I am Sophie. I'm a physical education major at Bloomsburg and Lock Haven. I'm a sophomore, and I'm hoping to be a gym teacher sometime in the future.
And if you would, please just tell me a little bit about this class. How are you finding it so far? Because I am constantly in process of revision and updating and trying to fix things. And so I'm always interested to hear from students, not just at the end of the semester evaluations, but in the middle of the process. And what do you like? What do you dislike? How is this course for you so far?
So as a comm studies major, I'm used to these types of courses where you have to communicate with other people, converse, that sort of thing. And I really enjoy that. That's why I'm in the major. I really like that sort of thing. So I really like that dynamic in the class, how it's not a lecture-based class, it's a communication-based class where you're learning how to effectively communicate with other people. So I really like that element of the class.
I'm not a typically anxious person, but your class does make me a bit anxious from time to time. I'm also not a very talkative person, so you're probably going to be really surprised by that considering how talkative I am in that class. So I guess that helps with my people skills.
It must, because you do talk quite a bit in the class.
Yeah, but if you saw me in my friend groups, I'm like the person who sits in the corner quietly and just listens.
Does that mean you're just like forcing it out in the class?
Our class is very introverted, I think. So I think I kind of overcompensate.
Interesting. I'm getting a new window into the group, even as we sit here today. Now, you two, much like some of our other special guests on this program, are interested in social media, and it seems to me that your whole generation is interested in social media. I guess everybody is at this point in history. And people come at it from different angles. Your particular angle concerns free speech and censorship, and it's typical on this program for us to try to talk a little bit about our key terms before we dive into discussing them. And so maybe you could offer us some definitions. What do you mean by social media? What do you mean by free speech? What kind of censorship do you imagine?
Content creation applications, networking applications, social applications, that sort of thing.
So applications meaning like the stuff you have on your telephone?
Yes.
Do you guys use social media on computers, or is it all phone-based at this point?
It depends on the application. I, for example, recently have tried to build up my LinkedIn profile, so as more of a professional social media application, and that I use both on my phone and on my desktop. But I think that's not common for younger people. Like, no one, I think, would use Instagram on their computer. I think that would just be odd, unless for some reason they didn't have access to their phone. But I think that most people would use applications like that on their telephone.
I've seen multiple people in classes go on Twitter and Snapchat on their laptops,
That's
so I
true.
wouldn't find it to be very uncommon, but I don't think I've seen someone scrolling on Instagram.
That, incidentally, is why I ask people in all of my classes not to use laptops. And I know that makes me a very unpopular figure, but I can't with this social media in the classroom. It's inescapable.
There's a lot of online shopping, too.
Of course. So when we talk about speaking on social media, I guess we're mostly talking about posting, right, is the term that we use for that now. And you have expressed some concern that people might not be able to post freely. What does that look like? When people get censored on social media, what forms does that take?
I don't know if it's necessarily a concern of mine. I think it may be just more of a curiosity. I think that people will sometimes post on social media and then get little notifications from the application saying, this violates our guidelines and here's why. But sometimes it doesn't have to be as heavy as that. Sometimes it's in a comment that they put on someone else's post. Sometimes it's in something that you repost onto your page from someone else. It's not always malicious in nature or devious in some way. Sometimes it can just be innocent and not harmful. But I do think that some people do view those actions from social media companies as censorship.
When we talk about free speech, because I am increasingly a Luddite, I imagine people speaking in real life and then the government cracking down on them, fining them for expressing an unpopular opinion or throwing them in jail for expressing, an opinion that was like forbidden by the state. But increasingly, when people talk about getting censored on social media, they're often referring to things like the accusation that Twitter's algorithm is not allowing as many viewpoints from a particular political persuasion to be seen by as many people, or someone might get blocked from a platform, or the stuff that they're posting might get labeled as misinformation, which harms their credibility. So that raises this question of what you're allowed to post on these platforms, how it will be presented, who will get a chance to see it, and what kind of labels will or will not be attached to it. And at that point, we're no longer talking about whether or not you're allowed to post. We're talking about how the platform is going to handle and deliver that information to the audience and whether or not it's doing so in a fair and equitable way. Is that accurate?
I think so, yeah. It's an interesting dynamic on social media because, as you mentioned, it's not a person standing in front of a crowd saying something and they get dragged down by police and thrown in jail. It's people doing it anonymously in some cases behind the wall of a screen, and they're doing it in many cases on privately owned platforms. So the social media platforms in question are often private spaces. They're owned by companies or specific people, and those companies or specific people can make their guidelines whatever they want, really.
Well, when we talked about this in class, I recall one student didn't seem to understand what the big deal was about, because he said, this is the platform owns this. This is theirs. They have their own terms of service. They have their own rules. They can do whatever they want. Mm-hmm. If they want to let you say whatever you want, that's fine. If they want to block you or shut you down, that's fine. Is that your take on the matter?
I think me personally, I don't really care what other people want or need to say. If they want to say it, I think that's completely fine. I think I understand why things need to be taken down for the safety of people. Me personally, I wouldn't be offended if my post got taken down. I wouldn't see my post getting taken down because I don't say outrageous things online. But as you said in class, people who do tend to say outrageous things online are the first people to outright say that their rights are being affected. because they're outrageous.
And I think in class we mentioned that if you don't agree with something that's happening online, if you're posting something on Instagram and Instagram takes it down and you think that that's not right, then don't use Instagram. And I do think that that's interesting, but at the same time, I think especially these privately owned social media companies, they have a lot of power, and it's interesting what they choose to do with it. Like, we're seeing a lot of that unfold right now with Elon Musk and Twitter, X. And so I think that I personally think that social media companies do have sort of a responsibility to do what's right.
Well, as your content for this discussion, you had us listen to an episode of the Crash Course podcast in which the host and a guest talked a lot about the law, basically. What is the First Amendment right to free speech? How is it applied? How has the Supreme Court been trying to navigate First Amendment cases? And all of that sort of thing. And central to that discussion was this question of whether or not social media platforms should be held liable if their users post bad or misleading information, and that leads to widespread social impacts and problems. And one of the examples they kept going back to was during the COVID-19 crisis, Donald Trump posting information that the people in charge of Twitter at that point were labeling misinformation. And eventually, they blocked him from that platform for that, which is a pretty significant thing to do considering he was president of the United States at the time. And so given that example, maybe you could weigh in on this and give us a clear sense of how you think about this. Do you think it was appropriate for a private company, Twitter, to block the president of the United States because of views that he was sharing freely on their platform?
I think it was appropriate only because he was the president of the United States. He has a lot of followers, and the things he says influences those followers to a degree that it can cause widespread panic, and that would harm the entirety of the United States, which we would not want to happen.
Donald Trump is an interesting case study because he was the first president to really use social media the way that he did throughout his campaign in his first term, throughout his campaign when he was seeking re-election, throughout his campaign this time around. It's really interesting how he uses social media and how he rallies his followers around him. And so I think when it comes to the COVID-19 era, he had a lot of power and could do a lot of damage and was doing a lot of damage. Some people to this day still have questions and conspiracy theories surrounding COVID-19. And I think that as the leader of our nation, he wasn't doing a great job at handling the public health crisis. He wasn't taking the role that a public official should. And he was actually doing the exact opposite, which Sophie mentioned, causing widespread panic. And I think that in cases where you have someone who's trying to cause widespread panic or incite violence in some cases, then I think that companies should have the right to mitigate that. I don't know if it means that they should block him outright, but if it does come to that, I could understand that.
If you're just joining us, I am speaking today with Jocelyn and Sophie on the subject of social media censorship. And in the course of this discussion, just in the last couple of responses here, you guys have used words that I think get right to the heart of the matter, including terms like incitement and harm. When free speech cases get litigated, as I understand it, this is an important consideration. It's my understanding anyway, and I think this is supported by the podcast, that in general, people in real life or on social media are free to say a lot of things right up until the point when the things that they are saying are actively harmful to other people. And the question of what constitutes harm is complicated, and it's something that can be dug into. But that seems to be the hinge. So in your view, where is that line drawn? Like, when does a post become sufficiently harmful to people that it needs to be blocked or labeled or something?
I think we mentioned in class that someone with a lower following would be less likely to be blocked or restrained because they're not having as much influence. So I think if only a few people are being affected by something, it doesn't have the leverage that someone with a higher amount of following would have. So obviously formats like X or Twitter would focus in more on people like Donald Trump or a celebrity because people follow them more and care more about what they say other than just an average everyday person.
That does turn into a slippery slope then, because then you have the option of censoring some people over others in terms of status or wealth or popularity or something like that. But I do think that the people who are at the top of the social media chains, who have the most influence, then have the most responsibility. So the things that they post matter a lot more than the things that you or I post on our private pages that'll only allow friends and followers to listen to. So I think that it's a difficult line to draw about who gets censored and over what, because if somebody who has 5 followers says something outrageous about COVID-19, 5 people may see it. But if Donald Trump says something outrageous about COVID-19, then the whole world has the capability of seeing it.
Okay, but let's forget about famous people here for a second. Let's just say it's me. I'm a nobody. I'm on Twitter. I have a small following, and I post something outrageous or something racist or something that could constitute an incitement to violence. Is a social media platform justified in, quietly snuffing out my small, insignificant voice?
If they deem it dangerous enough and they catch wind of it, I think so, yes. If they just don't notice it, I don't think it will get blocked at all. In class, Jocelyn referenced a post that she made on her Instagram page of a volcano and how that got blocked or censored. She obviously wasn't trying to be offensive or harm anybody, just Instagram caught wind of it and thought it could stress somebody out, so it blocked it.
It's a hard line to draw because some people may view Instagram blocking or labeling or censoring one of your posts as censorship, but in some cases it may just be looking out for the best interests of the public safety, public health safety, that sort of thing. If the social media companies have the public's best interest at heart and they are simply following their guidelines, their terms and condition guidelines, then they definitely have the right to take people's posts down over whatever it is that violates those guidelines. But I do think that can sort of lead to unfair censorship.
Okay, so far we seem to be adhering pretty closely to the screaming fire in a crowded theater standard for what constitutes harm. But I think we should touch maybe a little more directly on the distinction between free speech and hate speech. Because, if you're actively calling for violence against somebody, that seems to me like a pretty clear-cut case in which your account should probably be closed and maybe the police should be notified. But if I'm expressing a view that is sincerely held and just what I think or what I believe, but it turns out to be offensive to somebody else, I think the question then is a little bit more muddled. If you think that hate speech should fall beyond the protections of free speech, do you then also have a clear sense in your own mind of what should constitute hate speech?
I think so let's say that Jocelyn is a very important figure and I posted, I just don't really like Jocelyn very much. That's free speech. I can say that. If I said, I think we should go out and just jump Jocelyn on the streets, I think that's considered hate speech.
Yeah, I think that free speech becomes hate speech at the point in which it is no longer productive in conversation. It is damaging to the well-being of others to the point where it's sort of leading to or insinuating further cause or further action. So it's targeting people, inciting violence, and motivating people to do things towards other people.
When we talked about it in class, I think there was some consensus that hate speech would refer to an attack made against somebody based on some essential characteristic of who they are, like their race or their gender or sex or something like that. And one interesting example that came up is that somebody proposed or floated the question of whether or not religious beliefs were essential. And so if you attacked somebody in a post for their religion, should that constitute hate speech? Should that post be restricted? And I don't know the answer to that exactly. I think that in some cases there is an overlap between, for example, racial and religious considerations. If you're attacking somebody who is Muslim and who is also of Arab descent, I could see how those two things would overlap pretty quickly. The question that was posed in the class is, like, can you attack, say, a white Christian in the United States based on those qualities and have that be considered free speech? Or is that also considered hate speech? Or conversely, if you're walking across this campus, as you sometimes may be, and when they have like the street preachers on campus and they're accusing you of being a sinner and telling you you're going to hell and all this sort of thing, should that be considered hate speech? If you're just trying to walk to class and somebody's yelling all these like mean things at you when you're just trying to go about your day, do you think that in the real life context, the university should allow that to go on? Should they try to have these folks escorted off campus? What do you think about the questions involved there?
They absolutely shouldn't be allowed to be on campus. I've seen a lot of people last year was my freshman year, my first year actually ever experiencing something like that. I've seen students all around campus upset and anxious about those people who were protesting on the quad. If there is a wild group of people being anxious or upset about something someone is saying, I think that can be considered as hate speech, especially when it has to do with the way people just generally are. I remember on one of the signs it said, "Good people are going to hell." That just didn't make any sense to me.
Religion is a really interesting characteristic because it's really integral to some people's identity, their characteristics and things, but it's not one of those elements of their identity that they can't change. It's not your race, your ethnicity, that sort of thing. I do think that freedom of religion is really, really important. But in specifically the case of free speech, censorship, and hate speech, it might not fall into the category of hate speech, in my opinion. It might just fall into that sort of gray area between free speech and hate speech to persecute people on behalf of their religion. As you mentioned, oftentimes it overlaps with other categories. So religion often overlaps with race or ethnicity or that sort of thing. But as Sophie mentioned, the religious protesters on campus, they're an interesting study too because everyone on campus knows about them. A lot of people dread the day that they come around every year. But they do have a right to be here. So I personally don't agree with a lot of the things they say, but I think in many cases it could be worse for the university to step in and try to ban them from campus rather than just letting them say what they have to say.
Yeah, I guess I have two thoughts on the matter. One is that having grown up in a very conservative religious context, I think I can sort of relate to where they're coming from. I don't think they come to campus just to be nasty because they want to be nasty. I think they come to campus because they believe something about the world, the universe, they sincerely believe that lots of people on this campus are leading sinful lives and that their souls are bound for hell and that they're never going to change course unless somebody confronts them and puts that in front of them. And so in that sense, it could be considered an act of love. I'm not quite generous enough to grant them that, but I could see it as a possibility. But in also, this is a public campus, the practice, not just the belief in religion, but the exercise of religion is protected under the First Amendment. And so if they want to come here and proselytize or make accusations, I think it has to be allowed. And I think another benefit of it is that for the targets of their accusations and their comments, it's useful to be reminded why you don't go to their church. I think whatever the intent, I think the method is deeply flawed in that it is far more likely to turn people away from their beliefs than it is to bring anybody on board. Frankly, as like a persuasive exercise, it doesn't make much sense to me. But I believe in allowing people to say what they really think and believe, in part so that they can try and persuade people, but also so that people know exactly what they want to avoid. And whenever I see these folks on campus shouting at students as they walk to class, I sort of think to myself, it's good that you're able to say that so they know not to pay attention to you. Let's go ahead and cut to a break, and we'll pick up here after this brief message. You're listening to the Art of Conversation Radio. Welcome back to the Art of Conversation Radio. I am your host, Professor Eric C. Miller, and my guests today are Jocelyn and Sophie, and we've been talking about free speech, hate speech, censorship on the internet, on campus, and otherwise. So when we left off, we were talking a little bit about the example of religious proselytizing on campus and whether or not that deserved free speech protection. But I want to circle back a little bit and talk about the podcast that you had us listen to for our discussion in class, because it was focused in on an interesting case that concerned whether or not a local school board was within its rights to block members of the community who were posting aggressive comments on their Facebook page. Can you fill us in on this case a little bit and the issues at stake?
Yeah, so the case was surrounding as you mentioned, a school board and their Facebook page, and there were parents that had issues with the school board surrounding issues of race, and obviously the parents were very charged on this issue. They wanted to see some sort of change in the school board, so they...
But, not to interrupt, but they were, as I recall, the parents were complaining about racism in the district?
Yes.
They weren't opposed to the race of the people on the board, is that correct?
Yes, correct. They were accusing the school board of racism in the district, and they wanted to see change. And the school board eventually ended up blocking some of the parents from the page. The question there was, is that okay? Is that right? Is the school board then censoring some parents from participating in their children's education and the school board as a whole? It's an interesting case because, as we've seen with a lot of different sectors of politics at large, social media is becoming ever more present in those settings. So it's becoming, for some, a space of public discourse, a public forum, where they can exercise their civic duty of participating in a space like that. For the parents who were blocked from the page, it felt like they were shut out of those spaces.
So in other words, the question is, does the school board Facebook page constitute a public setting in which free speech rights are protected?
I think morally, especially in the regard to race, I wouldn't have blocked them only because they did feel strongly about the issues that they were talking about. Unbiasedly, though, I think that the school did have a right to do exactly what they did only because it is their Facebook page. Was it right? I personally don't think so, but they did have the right to do so.
I think it's interesting because if those parents were on the school board Facebook page saying different things, participating in hate speech, inciting violence, that sort of thing, then I think it's a clear no-brainer that the school board had the right to block them. But in the case of them simply seeking change within the district, and at that seeking positive change within the district, I think it's hard for me to see the logic behind the school board's decision.
So in other words, the parents here were not like inciting to violence.
Yes.
They weren't attacking members of the board. They were just very persistently calling for a change such that they became a nuisance and the board didn't feel like dealing with them anymore.
Correct.
But their free speech rights would have been maintained had they shown up to meetings and things like that, presumably. Another issue that arises there has to do with the distinction between a private social media account and a public social media account. And so, obviously, a school board with a Facebook page that allows parents and taxpayers to post comments clearly has like a public speech sort of inflection to it. But one thing they pointed out on the podcast that I thought was interesting is that increasingly, a lot of public figures, like members of Congress, for example, have multiple social media accounts. One that is their official account, and then another that is their private citizen account. And so sometimes if they post something on their private citizen account, they can separate it from their capacity as an elected official, or if they get in trouble for something they post on their private account, they can try to explain it away in that way. Or if they block someone as a private citizen, it just gets kind of murky here. Because while they do have two accounts, they do in a sense have two identities, they're still the same human being. So what do you make of this? Should public figures have private accounts and should they be treated differently in terms of free speech considerations?
I think a public figure should definitely be allowed to have two different accounts, but they still have to be mindful that they're constantly being watched. And you can't just say, oh, well, this is my public account, so I have to be more mature here, but on my private account, I can say whatever I want because you're not a different person. It's still your account. I have two different accounts on Instagram. One for which it's open for everyone. I post basically anything I want on it. And another one for when I post just family things, like my family is watching. So while I do post two different things, if my mom saw my public account with all my friends, she would still see things that I would allow her to see only because I know there's a possibility of her seeing it.
I'm in a class at Bloomsburg this semester called Work-Life Balance, and so we discuss the terms of integration, segmentation, that sort of thing when it comes to your personal life and your work life. So it's hard for me to get behind the fact that these public officials who have two separate accounts don't think that these accounts overlap in any case. I think that in a lot of cases, their audiences on their public accounts and their personal accounts can overlap, especially if their personal accounts are still public to the world. They're still registered as a public account online. And especially if they are a verified account by the social media company, if they have that little check mark by their name. I, for one, when I'm following people and looking at things online, if I follow Vice President Kamala Harris on her Vice President account and her regular Kamala Harris account, when I'm scrolling through my feed and I see a post from her come up, I'm not checking to make sure that it's her personal account or her Vice President account. I'm just reading her content as it comes up to me. So I think that a lot of people wouldn't really care about that distinction if they see Kamala Harris post something that they don't agree with, whether it's in her official vice presidential role or her public citizen role. They're gonna do something about it or say something about it or take offense to it.
I think it's interesting that people are now in the habit of like slicing up their personalities into different public-facing accounts. I'm on a school board, and I'm a college professor, and I'm like a parent, and I don't have like different accounts for all of these different parts of myself. And if I did, I would recognize that they're all at the end of the day the same person who is accountable to whatever gets posted. But I think it goes back to the question of blocking people in particular, because in this case, it was a school board blocking people, and they said, we can do this because it's our page. And the litigants said, you can't do this because you represent the public, and you have to be open to feedback from the public on this online venue. I haven't been on Twitter in a long time. I was driven from Twitter, I will say, by the malign forces at work there. But back then, I noticed already like a kind of a schizophrenic way that people talked about blocking. Like on the one hand, like if someone blocks me because I was like harassing them or trying to get them to like answer a question or debate me or something, and they block me, I would say, "Oh, you coward, face me, like don't run away." But then the same people who would say stuff like that, if they were being bothered by somebody, they would often brag about having blocked them. Like, oh, that one's no longer a concern for me. I guess this applies to elected officials as well. They are there to interact with people in these online venues, but they don't like being harassed and bothered. And so they like having the option to block people who are nagging them in bad faith. But they maybe also on some level recognize a responsibility to engage with the public in these settings.
I think it really determines the sense of maturity that a person has, because if you're getting, let's say, interrogated or verbally assaulted online, you have the chance to block someone, of course. But if you know that there's going to be backlash from you blocking them, I think the best case is just not to look at it. It just seems so simple, and it also seems so simple to just block somebody. But some people do really just have no option. If you're a famous person, like a presidential candidate, you blocking someone, it's going to give you issues. So I wouldn't in the first place.
It's also interesting because so many people nowadays get their news from social media, especially people in the younger generations. Their first line of news is the internet, social media. So if Kamala Harris were to block you from her vice presidential page or her personal page, that's her cutting you off from your line of communication, so to say, with the vice president. And then you don't get the news that you would have from the current vice president because you don't have access to her page anymore.
I think that raises another issue that we discussed in class, which was the question of how important, how serious social media discourse is. And I recognize I'm an outlier here and that I don't think it's that important or that serious. Everyone else seems to think that it is. And I guess I take that position in part because up until about 2010, I had been cut off from my personal connection to famous people by the fact that social media wasn't existent yet, certainly not in the form that it is now. And I could still learn about what the vice president's doing by watching the nightly news or by reading the newspaper or by reading articles on the internet. It's an anomaly that we can be directly connected to celebrities through these platforms now. It wasn't like that ever before in human history. And now that we've experienced it, many people seem to feel like entitled to it. And it's like, you're cutting off my connection to you directly on your personal handheld device? Like, how dare you? To me, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal if I get blocked by a famous person. Is it a big deal?
I think it's very parasocial. Like, I was never blocked by a celebrity, but I was replied back to by one of my favorite celebrities, and I thought it was the biggest thing in the world for a day. So if I was ever blocked by one of a celebrity that I felt strongly about, I think I would be a little bummed by it, but I don't think I would be really upset for longer than at least a day.
I like the word that Sophie used, the parasocial, because a lot of people do feel that they have a parasocial relationship with celebrities. This has been brought up a lot with Taylor Swift recently in recent news because her fans have this connection to her through her music and through her presence. they feel like they know her personally. And they don't. They have never, and most of them will never meet Taylor Swift in their life. They'll never know her on a level that's different than artist versus fan.
There's another artist called Chapel Rowan who has recently got backlash because she set boundaries. She said, I don't know you. You're not going to go up to a random person on the side of the road and ask, can I have a picture with you? Can you sign this for me? I don't want to speak to random people sometimes because I have my own life too. And people called her ungrateful. But in reality, she's just another person who just happened to recently come into fame. And people just were a little bit upset by the fact that she didn't want them to crowd her.
Yeah, so I do think that people have those strong connections to celebrities nowadays in all spaces, in political spaces, social spaces, and they would feel personally victimized or personally attacked if they were blocked from those spaces. It's like your favorite artist getting a restraining order against you and you can never go see them in concert ever again.
But isn't it wild that we live in a technological universe where that sort of thing is now thinkable for people? Before social media, you liked celebrities, you liked their work, you listened to their music, you read their books, whatever. But you're not going to sit in the bushes outside their house. At least most of us would not do that. But all of a sudden, because they're on social media, you feel like, I should be able to get in touch. And if they're not responding to me or if they're going to block me, that's such a personal affront. When it's like, listen, man, they weren't really thinking about you.
They don't even know you.
You just became a nuisance, and that was that. But it's different in the somewhat different, perhaps, in the context of elected officials interacting with their constituents in online spaces. And so to take this issue seriously is to concede that the speech that takes place in the comment thread of the school board Facebook page is important speech. And that avenue should remain open and unobstructed to all users. But I've been on social media a little bit, and I've seen the type of stuff that gets posted there, and I'm a little skeptical of that because I don't know how valuable it is. Can I paint with a broad brush? Can I make the statement that the stuff that people post online is not that compelling, not that important, or does it have to be taken on a case-by-case basis?
I think that's interesting because I think a lot of people, not to be offensive in any way, but a lot of people of your generation and higher,
Okay.
A lot of people in your generation and higher and older may think that way, that social media is just silly and fun. And a lot of people our age probably think the same way.
I think that way.
So yeah, maybe I'm the outlier here, but I do use social media in a silly and fun way, but also in a professional networking sort of way. I have recently really tried to build up my LinkedIn profile, use that a little bit more. I follow a lot of news networks on social media of all different realms, I'll say. And I think I do that because I don't want to just limit myself online. I want to learn and try to use social media in a way that is productive and engaging. As a media minor, I feel compelled to do that.
When I use social media, I use it strictly for just relaxing. I don't like to read anything political or indulge myself in celebrity gossip. What I normally do is I just read or I'll just watch YouTube videos. I don't own the Twitter app or X. I don't go on any celebrity page on Instagram. It's just not what I do. Do I still hear about the things that go on? Sure, but I don't like to engage in it.
It probably is a generational thing. Not to be offensive in any way, but I don't think LinkedIn matters either. I don't think anybody looks at it.
I don't think I've used it in a few weeks now.
But I don't mean to minimize social media participation. I think that it does. When it first came out, I remember thinking it had a lot of promise. It was going to connect people to the political process and to issues and to each other and to their elected officials in exciting new ways. And just because I think that promise has not been realized, it's been replaced by misinformation and disinformation and division and ugliness, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have some promise still. And so the example that came up in our class discussion was that 10, 15 years ago, when the Arab Spring uprisings were going on in North Africa and in the Middle East, a lot of people were using Twitter and other social media platforms to connect with one another, to coordinate their activities, to identify, where the oppressive agents of the state were waiting to arrest them and things like that. And for that one shining moment, to me, it was like social media is politically important. And these people are using it at considerable risk to themselves in order to try and create positive change. And that's like a really inspiring thing. It's just that the rest of the time it was just like cat videos and like people screaming at each other in comment threads. So the promise is still there. I wonder if maybe the platforms could be regulated in such a way that they could improve the quality of their discourse, and they could protect their users from being both verbally assaulted and misled into believing flatly untrue things. Have you thought about that at all? Like, maybe it's not a question necessarily of whether the social media platform silences you or labels your comments as misinformation or blocks you from the platform entirely. Are there tweaks that they can make? Are there things that they can do or have done that would make the speech on their platform more truthful, more edifying, more useful for a democracy?
I don't know if they do this because I'm not on social media enough, but I think it'd be very helpful if there were kind of interest boxes where you can select what stuff you want to view. If I had an interest box that said, would you or would you not like to see anything political? And if I said no, I just never saw anything political, and if any day or time I decide, I think I want to switch it on to yes today, then I could. I think that would help a lot.
I guess I'm thinking too of from the posting side of things, like what you're talking about, like the reading side of it. You don't want to be exposed to certain content, so you like filter it out. But if, let's just say there is a town council or something that has a Facebook page and there's some important policy being considered in that community, it's divisive, people disagree, and they want to get on there and they want to kind of hash it out. I don't know exactly what I would suggest, but I have to think that there are guardrails they could put in place to help people interact with each other more productively and try to create a consensus, the way that deliberative bodies try to do when they're sitting around a table. What we have right now doesn't really do that. It's just kind of a free-for-all until you say something that violates the terms of service, and then you get the hook. So I don't know. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, because social media companies do have their set terms of agreement. And then if, let's say, people on a school board Facebook page wanted to comment something, they can't just comment whatever they want. They have to obviously follow the terms of agreement set by the company. So if they tried to comment something that used expletives, slurs, that sort of thing, they would get their comment removed almost immediately, I think. Maybe one solution for social media companies could be that they let people or pages fit into groups based on what they want to be posting and how they want others to be reacting to their content. For example, if a school board wanted to fit into the public sphere but school board category, then the commenters on their posts would go through different filters than the normal terms of agreement in order to get their words on the school board page. So Instagram wouldn't just be filtering for swear words, slurs, that sort of thing. They would be filtering for specific things that the school board deems inappropriate or unnecessary or unproductive to conversation. And then those comments get rejected under different conditions. But I do think that that can then become dangerous territory of limiting too many people and too many things.
Well, that's kind of what I mean too. Like, I don't understand how algorithms work, but if they could be manipulated in such a way as to prioritize the most constructive content, even when you go down that road, though, because we don't understand how they work, it raises all sorts of questions for who's pulling the strings behind the screen and how these decisions are being made. The only way that I've seen that I think is purely transparent and open is like what they do on Reddit and other sites where you can upvote content. And so there's an incentive to say like the smartest or most insightful thing or the funniest thing, because then people will support it and it'll move up the list and it'll get seen by more people. But even that, I think, is vulnerable to abuse, because sometimes people vote for stuff that's inaccurate or that's offensive. And sometimes they do it specifically for those reasons. And so it can create problems on its own. So ultimately, remind me, when we got to the end of this discussion in class, I mean, your key question was, should social media be censored? Or should free speech on social media be limited in any way? And I know some people are of the mind that it just shouldn't, but I don't get that sense with you. I think you agreed that it should be limited in some way. I just don't recall specifically how or what kinds of limits you would place.
I would put limits on anything that could be deemed gorish or explicit to the fact that you wouldn't let children see it. If you wouldn't let your parents or your children see it, I don't think it should be on there.
You mean like pornography and violence?
Yes, like I wouldn't want to see anything that...
Harmful?
I guess harmful, or reenacting something that can be considered horror-like. Anything that can scare somebody.
When we discussed this matter in class, a lot of people had concerns about if social media companies start select censoring certain information, who's making those decisions? What standard are they using to weigh material against? And I do think that that is a big question that social media companies need to work on. But I do think that since they are in a global sphere, they have a global platform that so many people use for so many different purposes, they have a responsibility to their public, I think. At least in cases of public safety, public health safety, individual safety, I think that they are a private company and they can do what they please, but they have a responsibility to their users to keep them safe and away from harmful or misleading content. And if there are people posting harmful or misleading content, then they should take act against them.
I don't mean to also baby people, but there should at least be a tag or like a blurred screen above things saying, do you wish to see this graphic content? That's censorship that I think is very important, because if you're just scrolling and you immediately see something that can scar you, I don't think that's needed.
We talked in class a lot about the difference between labeling and suppression. So there's a difference between social media companies taking your post and just removing it from the internet versus taking your post about COVID and putting a little link at the bottom from the CDC saying, click here if you want to learn true, accurate information from the CDC about COVID. That's not Instagram saying, hey, your content is outright dangerous or misleading. It's just them saying, hey, we want to give your viewers other options to find their news as well.
Jocelyn and Sophie, thank you for joining me on the program today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been another exciting episode of The Art of Conversation here on 91.1 WHSK The Husky. This show is brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism here at Commonwealth University, Bloomsburg. As always, I am your host, Eric C. Miller, and we'll see you next time.